Okay, learning outcome D14 is talking about lipids, so let's take a look at those. Alright, so what are lipids? Well, lipids are basically fats, but there's a lot of different classes of lipids. Basically, the chemical properties of lipids, they are hydrophobic, meaning they are water-fearing. They don't like water. They will not dissolve in water. And that has to do with the fact that they are have non-polar covalent bonds. Now, compared to carbohydrates, lipids are very, very high in energy. Much, much higher in energy than carbohydrates are. But there's some reasons why our body doesn't rely exclusively on lipids. And that's something we'll address next semester in Biology 106. Alright, basic structure. There's really no defined ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. There's typically going to be a very, very high ratio of hydrogen to oxygen. And what that means is that there's going to be significantly higher numbers of hydrogen than there is oxygen. Significantly. In fact, if you look at these lipids here, and these lipids here are fatty acids. Specifically, one type of lipid is a fatty acid. You can see that there's a very long chain of hydrocarbons, all with carbons and hydrogens attached together. And then here we have, remember what this group is? What functional group that is? You said carboxyl. You would be correct. That is a carboxyl group. So we have this here. This is palmitic acid. This is stearic acid. And this is linoleic acid. And you've heard of saturated and unsaturated fats. Well, the term saturated and unsaturated has to do with the amount of hydrogens that are attached to these hydrocarbon chains on these fatty acid chains. Unsaturated fatty acids, there's all single bonds between the carbons. There's no more room to add any more hydrogens. However, if we look at a double bond here, or an unsaturated fatty acid, we can see that there's a double bond here and a double bond here. Well, if those double bonds were to be broken, we could add hydrogens here, 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 and here. So basically what we're saying is that this is an unsaturated fatty acid. One of the things that fatty acids do is that they undergo a metabolic reaction, specifically anabolism, called dehydration synthesis. And what happens is a glycerol molecule reacts with 3 different fatty acid chains. And what we get is we break off a water molecule. So we take a hydrogen off of the fatty acid and a hydroxide off of the glycerol for each fatty acid chain. And when we join them together, we get this. Here is our fatty acid, or our triglyceride here. Tri meaning 3 fatty acids, glyceride meaning that those fatty acids are bonded to a glycerol. Here's what we originally had. Here's our triglyceride, and here is our water. One of the things I didn't mention before is that there's a little law of the universe called the law of conservation of matter, or mass, and that is that in any chemical reaction you have to have the same amount of matter at the end of the reaction as you did at the beginning of the reaction. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Is that we can account, and we can physically, if we wanted to, count the number of carbons in each of these, and we would have the same amount of atoms and the same number of atoms, the same types of atoms at the beginning of the reaction as we would at the end of the reaction. Alright, so different fatty acids have different functions. if we look at triglycerides, triglycerides have a variety of different functions. Number one, energy storage. These are what are stored in our adipose tissue. They provide thermal insulation. They allow for shock absorption. And they help to bind organs together. And we're going to find this mainly associated with adipose tissue, which is clusters of individual adipocytes or individual adipose cells. Now, we can have, as I said, saturated and unsaturated, but we can also have things that are called polyunsaturated. And these would be fatty acids that are going to have more than one or more than two double bonds in that fatty acid chain. I would think that this would actually be a polyunsaturated, and then just one would be monounsaturated. So we don't have disaturated. We have monounsaturated fatty acids and we have polysaturated fatty acids. So just something to keep in mind. Another type of triglycerides are phospholipids, and these are very, very similar to triglycerides except for one difference, and that is instead of having 3 fatty acid chains bonded to the glycerol, there's only 2 fatty acid chains. So here's your glycerol here, and we have an oxygen, and here's our fatty acid chain. Here's our next fatty acid chain. Well, instead of having a 3rd fatty acid chain, what we have is a phosphate group, a very specialized phosphate group that has a hydrocarbon chain attached to it. And we're going to find these phospholipids associated with what we call the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. And this is kind of what they look like. We have this head here and these 2 little tails. It's kind of like a 2-headed sperm cell. So we have this phosphate head, phosphate glycerol head, and then we have these 2 fatty acid chains. And these make up the plasma membrane, as I said. We will address this in more depth when we talk about the plasma membrane in Chapter 3, but I do want to tell you that this phosphate glycerol head is hydrophilic, meaning it's water-loving, and the fatty acid chains here are hydrophobic. And when you have a molecule that has both hydrophilic and hydrophobic regions, this molecule is called amphiphilic, meaning it has both hydrophobic and hydrophilic regions. And again, amphiphilic, not amphiphilic. And we'll address this in more depth when we get into Chapter 3 and talking specifically about the properties of the cell membrane. Final lipid I want to talk about is cholesterol. And you hear the term cholesterol, people think, ooh, cholesterol, bad stuff. Well, that's not really the case. Cholesterol is actually something made by our bodies, made by our liver. It's actually very important. It actually plays a role in cell membranes, in stabilizing cell membranes. They also play a role in synthesizing hormones. Many of our body's hormones, specifically our steroid hormones, are derived from cholesterol. So cholesterol is important. Now there is a difference between what we call good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. And that has to do with how the cholesterol is packaged and transported in the body. Okay, your LDLs are considered to be your bad cholesterol, and your HDLs are considered to be your good cholesterol. And a diet and high in saturated fats can actually stimulate the body to produce cholesterol and excess cholesterol. Some people have a genetic predisposition to producing a lot of cholesterol, and that can lead to heart disease and atherosclerosis and things of that nature. Again, we'll address cholesterol a little more depth when we specifically talk about the plasma membrane, as it does play a role in that as well. I did mention steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol. These hormones would include things like testosterone, estrogens, and progesterone, vitamin D. If you look at cholesterol, it has this very characteristic four-ring structure here. And when we look at the testosterone and estrogens and other cholesterol-based molecules, we will still see that four-ring structure, but with some modifications, some additions or deletions to that molecule in certain ways to produce the specific molecule that's needed.